So I want to start this video off with the strongest spoiler alert possible. If you have not seen the Connor's Wedding episode of Succession, don't watch this video. Just turn it off. It doesn't matter. I'm not monetized. I'm not making money off this anyway. I can tell you to go away. Do not watch this video if you haven't seen that episode yet. Okay, so let's talk about Connor's Wedding, because I honestly believe it may be the greatest episode of television of the decade so far, and maybe even the greatest episode of television since Ozymandias from Breaking Bad. And I'm just going to talk extemporaneously here. This is not my forte. I haven't scripted a response to the episode. If I tried to sit down and script a real analysis of the episode, I probably wouldn't record this video for my 0 subscribers. So I just want to talk about it because this episode had a real freaking impact on me. There were moments during this episode where there were tears in my eyes, which I mean, I am not going to pretend that I have never cried at a television show or movie before that, and I'm not even going to pretend that it's a complete rarity, but for a show like Succession, which is so good at holding you at a kind of cold emotional distance from these characters, for a show that almost wants you to cultivate a kind of active disdain for the characters, for a show like that to bring you very close to tears, or maybe even to tears, over the death of a character who is, I think, through the perspective of the writers now, not necessarily through my perspective, but who is written to be a kind of abhorrent and despicable human being, right? That is an incredible accomplishment. And it's something that the writers accomplish without, I think, engaging in any kind of trickery, any kind of manipulation. Because it's very easy, I think, to get tears out of an audience, to get an emotional response out of an audience through manipulation. You know, and you see a lot of, you know, Grey's Anatomy type shows, let's say. these calculated tearjerkers that will use musical cues and ironic tragedy and all of these manipulative, calculated devices to get you to feel emotion. And Succession doesn't do that. In fact, Succession has spent 3 seasons and 3 episodes now placing you at an intentional emotional distance. That's not to say there haven't been emotional scenes in the series before, right? In fact, the season 3 finale contained that kind of incredible moment of reconciliation between, you know, the 3 siblings, between Shiv and Kendall and Roman, where Kendall, like, finally opens up, you know, about the fact that he killed a man. And you certainly see, aside from that scene, moments where these characters are experiencing real emotion, real despair, real agony that isn't simply played for laughs. But nonetheless, even those scenes are often exactly that, single scenes within the fabric of larger episodes. And those scenes are often bookended either by, you know, plot points that are designed to serve as a reminder of the kind of cutthroat and ugly world that these characters inhabit, or more often than that, are simply bookended by purely comic scenes. You know, they might be darkly comic scenes, but often by comic dialogue scenes that are supposed to make us remember that these are pretty shallow, banal people. So the show has never before attempted this kind of unbroken, perpetual motion machine of human agony and human despair And so to do that for the first time in an episode, and to nail it the way this episode does, to nail it in a way that makes the audience feel real pathos for these characters, really feel bad for these characters, is remarkable. But let's set that aside for a moment. Let's set that aside, and let's talk about something else that this episode does that's rare in the annals of great television. If you think about great television episodes, if you think of single episodes of television shows that are widely considered to be the apex of the form, how often are those episodes climatic episodes of those series? How often are those episodes even truly representative of those series? So let me give a few examples here, right? Let's talk about the X-Files, because the X-Files in some ways, I think, was kind of the dawn of prestige TV. I know that seems weird to think about because the series had a lot of flaws. We could talk forever about the mythology episodes and its failure to deliver on like some of its fundamental aspirations, but it also, I think, kind of set the template for what we consider prestige TV today, right? Like serialized storytelling, a real attempt to integrate the emotional and psychological arcs of the characters into the more procedural drama, which, once again, the X-Files was not the first or only show to do that. But also, another thing the X-Files did is it gave birth, in a lot of ways, to some of these prestige series that would come after, right? Gave birth to the talent that would go on to create these shows. Vince Gilligan is the obvious example, right? Vince Gilligan cuts his teeth in the X-Files writing room and then goes on to create Better Call Saul, goes on to create Breaking Bad. So you see, I think, in the X-Files a kind of cultivation of both like the kind of template that would eventually evolve into like serialized prestige TV, and also like the cultivation of the talent that would go on to create prestige TV. So if you think about the X-Files, what's broadly considered to be one of the greatest episodes of the X-Files? Well, if you ask somebody this, you would probably get a lot of different answers to that question. But I think one of the favorite answers is Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose. And if you look at that episode and you compare it to what you would consider the archetypal episode of the X-Files, whether that's a procedural horror episode, right, like a Monster of the Week episode, or if you compare it to the other kind of archetypal X-Files episode, which is one of the mythology episodes, you know, an episode that advances the overarching conspiracy plot of the series, it really fits neither of those forms. It's not at all tied into the series' larger mythos, and it's also not really a conventional Monster of the Week story, because it's not a horror story. It's fundamentally a kind of dark existential comedy. So what's another critically acclaimed series? Well, how about The Sopranos? You're not really going to get a more archetypal prestige show than that, right? And if you ask people, what's the greatest episode of The Sopranos? Well, they're probably not going to say Made in America, even though that is the climax of the series. It's actually a deeply polarizing episode. There are a lot of people who are still, I think, fundamentally unhappy with the way the show ended. I'm not one of them. I think it's actually a great episode of television. But you're much more likely to hear Pine Barrens. Pine Barrens is another case where you're dealing with an episode that's a real departure in form from the series. It's a bottle episode, right? It's an episode about two characters, Paulie and Christopher, being out in the woods hunting this escaped hitman. It's not a complete departure from what I think you would consider to be a standard Sopranos episode, but it's very different. It's definitely a high concept episode. And while we're talking about bottle episodes. What about The Suitcase from Mad Men? That's another case where the episode that's kind of broadly considered to be the pinnacle of the series is a bottle episode, is this kind of small, constrained episode that sets aside a lot of the complex workplace dynamics and complex plot construction, right, that the series is known for, and instead very narrowly focuses on the relationship between two characters. In this case, instead of Paulie and Christopher, it's Don and Peggy. So the point I'm making here is it's very rare for the greatest episode of a television series to feel like an archetypal episode of that series. And in some cases, it's even rarer for the greatest episode of a series to be the climatic episode of that series. Which isn't to say the finale, but the episode that serves as a kind of culmination of the plot up until that point. In fact, great television often totally eschews plot, or if not totally eschews plot, kind of sets this plot aside, puts it on the back burner, and fixates on the characters. There is one huge exception to this, though, and that's Ozymandias. Ozymandias is at once widely considered to be, first of all, the greatest episode of Breaking Bad, while also being a completely archetypal episode of the show, a completely typical, you could say, episode of the show in terms of the way it's structured. It's another instance where Walt gets in over his head and has to dramatically and quickly think his way out of a really perilous situation while wildly bungling that, and also coming into direct conflict with his family. It's an exploration of all of the usual themes of Breaking Bad. It's an exploration of Walt's pathological pride. It's an exploration of the family dynamics that are at the heart of the series. It's an exploration of the deep fundamental conflict between Walt's desire to satiate his pride and his desire to do right by his family. And it's also a complete clusterfuck in the way that almost every episode of Breaking Bad was a clusterfuck, in the sense of it being a kind of high-wire act over a trash fire. In addition to that, it's also the climax of the series. And yes, I know there are 2 episodes afterwards, Granite State and Felina. But Ozymandias is the moment that all of the plot threads of the series reach their culmination. As such, it's a real rarity that you'll have an episode that is all 3 of those things. That is the greatest episode of the series, that is a typical archetypal episode of the series, and that is also the climax of the series. And you know what? Connor's Wedding is all of the above. It's the greatest episode, I think, up to this point of Succession, keeping in mind that Succession is still going. It's the greatest episode of the series because it's so emotionally effective, because it's operating at a level of writing, at a level of emotional resonance, a level of understanding of the profound psychological complexity of grief. You get to see all of these characters grieving Logan's death and responding to Logan's death, and all of these incredibly conflicted and sophisticated and, above all else, true ways. And it's funny. It's still darkly hilarious throughout. There are so many moments in that episode where there were tears in my eyes, but I was laughing. It's a powerful work of art, but it's also in every sense an archetypal, a standard, you would even say, episode of the series. Because what is it at its core? It's a series of conversations between these characters. What happens in your standard Succession episode? You see Shiv and Roman and Kendall and maybe Connor come into familiar conflict that's often set off by something their father does. And that's rooted deeply in their unbelievably conflicted and confused feelings about Logan. Their desire to simultaneously make him proud and defy him. The fact that they want revenge on him, but they also want him to love them. They want to escape the, intense gravity of his personality and his character, while also fulfilling his expectations for them, becoming the people that they think that he wants them to be. And all of those conflicts are present and accounted for in this episode. And the structure of the episode is exactly what you'd expect from an episode of Succession. There's a kind of instigating event. In this case, it's Logan simultaneously departing to go try to negotiate a new deal for the Waystar buyout while Connor's wedding is going on, and while putting Roman in this really precarious situation where he has to decide, is he going to betray Jerry, who he obviously has real feelings for, or is he going to be loyal to his father? And if you did not know where this episode was going, you would not think that it's going to be a particularly pivotal or different episode of the series. You would think, oh, okay, this is another instance of Logan picking business over family. It's one of the more sadistic instances of this, since he simultaneously neglects one son's wedding while telling the other to fire his lover. Right? But it's still, that's a pretty standard setup for a Succession episode. And in some ways, the progression is exactly what you'd expect. It leads to a series of scenes where characters stand in a room together and argue and yell at each other and contradict each other and jockey with each other. So yeah, it's structured and plotted just like another episode of the series. It's also the climax of the series, right? And I don't think I have to belabor this point. It's the climax of the series because the single event that we have been anticipating from the pilot finally happens. Logan dies. The title of the series is fulfilled, right? The title is Succession. This is ultimately the fundamental pitch of this series is what's going to happen after Logan is gone. And finally, and I don't say finally to, criticize the series at all, because I think it's been stellar up to this point. But finally, we get the delivery on the promise of the title. Finally, we get this moment in the series where for the first time ever, the Roy kids are alone in the world. Their father isn't there anymore. And what are they going to do? So to have those three components come together in a great episode of television, to have there not be a false step anywhere along the way, is tremendous and really rare. But I want to talk about the bottle episode thing, because I said earlier, well, the suitcase is a bottle episode, which makes it a kind of non-standard episode of the series. Pine Barrens is a bottle episode, which makes it kind of a non-standard episode of the series. And by bottle episode, I don't mean it in the more traditional sense of like a cheap episode, a cheap throwaway episode, but rather just an episode that's mostly about characters being confined in a small space and having to interact with each other and having to like work through their emotions without being able to escape each other's presence. Well, shit. If you think about it, this episode is a bottle episode. It's actually a kind of dual bottle episode, because you have really just aside from the final few scenes after the plane lands, you have really just two settings for this episode. You have the boat where Connor's wedding is occurring, and you have the plane where Logan has died and they're trying to resuscitate him while the while the kind of Waystar apparatchiks, the bureaucracy of Waystar Royco kind of try to simultaneously juggle the question of what do we do now that Logan is gone from a business perspective, while also trying to resolve the more concrete question of, is Logan dead? Can we save this man? And the fact that you have those two settings, and in both of those settings, the characters are trapped. You have the plane over international waters. They have to turn the plane around, bring the plane back. And on the other hand, you have the ferry where the wedding is occurring. And yes, actually, early in the episode, it would be possible for Shiv and Kendall and Robin to get off the boat. But there's a moment about midway through the episode when they realize the boat is leaving. And that becomes a major plot point. And up to that point, obviously, they've been so consumed by the shock of what's going on, they don't think to leave the boat. So this is a kind of bottle episode. But it's a bottle episode that defies the expectations of a bottle episode. Because one of the fundamental aspects of the bottle episode is that the characters can't communicate with those outside of the bottle, outside of the confined space. And that happens constantly throughout this episode. In fact, one of the central sources of drama and uncertainty in this episode is the phone calls between the characters on the plane, mostly Tom, and the characters on the boat, the Roy family. And if you look at the way bottle episodes usually play out, like the X-Files, to go back to the X-Files, had some really archetypal bottle episodes. And the way those episodes were always set up, a central fact of the episode was there's no way for Mulder and Scully to contact the world outside of this Arctic base or boat or lumber camp that they're trapped in. And that inability to communicate with the outside world fuels the drama of the entire episode. And here we have a case where the lines of communication with the outside world are not broken at all. Anyone in the plane can talk to anyone on the ground or in the boat, and anyone in the boat can call anyone. But the episode does something really fascinating with that. It doesn't simply throw away the aspect of isolation and failure to communicate, or inability to communicate, that is so central to bottle episodes. Instead, it uses the nature of communication in the episode as a way to really underscore the larger themes of the series. Let me break this down for you, because this is a thought I had, and maybe it's kind of out there, maybe it's kind of weird, but think about it this way. Here's a series where people are constantly talking to each other. The vast majority of this series is dialogue, and yet intimacy, real intimate, open communication often escapes them. Real closeness often and almost inevitably escapes these characters. So what you have here, you have a situation where these characters can, once again, freely communicate with each other at this moment, at this critical juncture of intense grief, of intense emotion. All of these characters can talk freely with each other, but they can't do the one central thing that they really desperately need and want to do at this moment, which is to be together, to be physically in the same set space, to have some real emotional intimacy with each other. There is that series of unbelievably heartbreaking moments where each of the Roy children has to say goodbye to their father over the phone, not even knowing if he's alive, not knowing if he can fucking hear them at all. And those moments, in some ways, really capture like the entire spirit of failed communication, failed real communication. That's at the heart of the series. For so many reasons, on so many levels. First of all, obviously, they would love to be in the room with Logan when he dies, because there's so much you can gain from being next to someone. Instead of being forced to try to think of adequate words to say over the phone, they could squeeze his hand. They could see if his hand is still warm, which would be meaningful in a moment like that, right? Because that tells you something real about whether he's dead or not, whether he's fully gone or not. They would be able to actually whisper these words in his ear. They would be able to actually gain a kind of catharsis and a kind of closure that's just not possible with the deep ambiguity of telling someone words over the phone knowing he might be a corpse already. There's also an even more concrete and practical consequence to the fact that these characters are in different spaces, that these characters can only communicate with each other on the phone. And that's that any chance that might have existed to save Logan's life is lost. There is absolutely nothing any of the Roy children can actually do to save Logan. And that's a function of a choice that Logan made. That's a function of the fact that he chose to get on that plane and try to save the merger rather than get on the boat and attend his son's wedding. And that's the case, obviously, because if he had the attack on the boat, not only would he have been closer to land, right? The boat is docked for the first half of the episode. Not only would it have been way easier to get him in an ambulance, but also someone would have been much more likely to notice that he had had a heart attack or a stroke earlier. Remember, in the plane, he goes in the bathroom. We don't see this on screen, but he goes in the bathroom, and it's a while before anyone realizes that something is wrong. And also, he's surrounded by sycophants who would be utterly terrified to barge into that bathroom to check on him. So you don't know how much time elapsed. Whereas on the boat, not to belabor a really practical point here, but he would have been surrounded by family and friends, and somebody, well, family and friends, and somebody probably would have picked up on what was going on earlier, and they would have been able to intercede earlier to potentially save his life. So what you have is a practical bottle, right? You have a physical bottle. You have constrained spaces that are preventing real intimacy, that are preventing real physical connection between these characters, that are preventing these characters from saving each other, from giving each other what they need, but that don't serve as actual barriers to simple rote communication. So the entire episode plays out as a series of completely hopeless conversations, completely hopeless, despairing conversations between people who can't do anything more meaningful. And man, that's incredible, because that's the entire series in one episode, perfectly encapsulated in a way that never seems simply heavy-handed and ironic, that never seems like it's winking and gesturing at the camera, in a way that really feels like you're capturing these characters in a moment of agony, in a moment where they don't know what to do, and watching them play through their emotions in real time with real psychological astuteness and truth. And yet, it's it's just another episode of the series, you know? And that's incredible. Is that a bug? Come on, buddy. Come on. I need you to get off of here. I don't want to crush you. Okay. Okay, so what are some other critically acclaimed series? The Sopranos. Well, there's a bug on my neck. In an unbelievable number of ways. Okay. There's a fly on me.